And we really are at an advertising conference. I've never heard more lies about me than I just did. Let me begin by asking the audience a question, unlike the way we've gone so far. How many people here have been hauled up by ASCII for something that they've written or created? Oh, come on, it can't just be the guys in the back. What, none of you guys here have been hauled up by ASCII? How many of you have actually been charged by a judicial body because something you wrote or created offended someone? How many of you have actually been convicted because something you wrote or created offended a certain section of society? So, now that we've established that I'm the only convicted criminal in the room, that I'm the only one who's had his constitutional rights trampled upon because someone didn't like what he wrote, I am now the authority on the rest of this debate, so none of you have got a leg to stand on. What is decent, what is not, what is offensive, what is not, who the hell is going to decide for us? Advertising is a mirror of popular culture. We've heard that over the years. It embodies, it narrates what society tells it to. If advertising responsibility is primarily to the brand, at what point does that responsibility cross that line that we just saw on the screen back there? Does advertising have a responsibility to society as well? Is there a point where you tell your client, no, we can't do that? We've talked about diverse geographies through the afternoon. And in a country like India, where you have societies and cultures that are so diverse across geographies, is it okay to say one thing in one part of the country, but not in another? Is it okay to tell those jokes about sections of society, different communities? Is it okay to talk about gender inequality in certain states where gender equality is a part of life? What is improper? What's not? I'm going to call my panel up. Brian's actually given me 3-page long bios for each and every one of them, but I'm going to ignore them completely because I suspect you all know who they are. So I'd like to call on stage Bobby Pawar, Chief Creative Officer of Publicis; Santosh Desai, Managing Director and CEO of Future Brands; Paritosh Joshi, Director of Provocateur; and Sanjeev Chaudhari, Global Head and CMO of Standard Chartered Bank. Piyush Pandey was supposed to be on this panel, but once he heard the topic, Piyush said, I haven't done anything decent in my life, so I can't possibly be up there. Guys, I'm going to kick this off with standards. When I did my first radio show 35 years ago, there were 7 words that you couldn't use on radio. Strangely enough, 35 years later, those 7 words are still words that you can't use on radio unless you're Howard Stern, in which case you can say pretty much anything you want. Paritosh, I'm going to start with you. If I have it right, you're the only one who's actually a member of the council, correct? No one else is.
No one else.
So we've heard all these wonderful things about ASCII, we've heard about, and let's ignore honesty, because we all know that every ad ever created has always told the truth. No one in this room has ever lied, well, except their wives. But if ASCII was doing its job, we wouldn't need to be having this debate, would we? Clearly, self-regulation is not working.
As good a time to get onto the back foot as any other. I think the commonest criticism that ASCII receives, and I've seen it across the 7 years that I've been involved with it, people like Narendra and Sam and Sundar, who've been here a lot longer, have probably heard it for much longer than that. Uh, we heard many themes today. For example, one of the themes that seems to have been recurrent is that uh, rules, regulations, guidelines are moving targets. What constitutes acceptable at one point in time is not at another, and what might have been acceptable in the past may not be acceptable now. We also see that there is egregious violations of everything in the code book that actually does go into the media, and therefore it is not unusual for us to confront this particular criticism that you guys screwed up. And here's the problem: people miss the one word in this entire phrase, self-regulatory body. Is the first word is self, actually. We are not somebody outside. ASCII is not other than the people who are being regulated. So in a sense, the regulator and the regulated, the object of the regulation is the person who's doing the regulating and contributing to it.
Hang on a second. When I was talking to Santosh earlier, the first thing he said was the problem with the complaints that come in is that it's always the same people who are violating the guidelines. And those same people who are violating the guidelines are almost invariably the largest advertisers, either as agencies or as advertisers or clients.
Well, on a purely statistical basis, that is not actually correct. I mean, if you look at the number of...
We've got Dorab over there. Lies, damned lies, and statistics.
That's right. And Dorab is one of the people who actually draws attention to this in our own meetings. You're right. Largest advertisers routinely feature in this list. The largest advertisers feature, and their defense, and I'm not sure whether it's a legitimate defense, is that the number of ads that they process through their massive engine of sort of advertising creativity is larger than what any other advertiser might be doing, and therefore there are a few things that slip through the cracks, that they try their darndest using their legal means through sort of conscientizing people about the code and all of that to ensure that there is internal compliance, and yet the odd guy actually falls through the cracks. I'm not sure that's something that the ASCII is proud of, and certainly the CCC on its part, which is the body that actually evaluates the complaints, routinely tells the board that these people should be named and shamed, that it's like the 3 strikes and you're out kind of a rule, that if you keep being a repeat offender, there has to be a time when there is some penalties and which are stricter than saying that we took that particular ad down.
So is it time someone else came in and said, you can't regulate yourselves, we need to do it for you?
There was and there continue to be attempts to do that. For example, the usual answer is, why don't we get a bureaucrat in charge of that? And is that what you really, really want? Is the best answer to this that, if we can't do it, we won't, here's how we look at it. Our way of looking at it is that it's an iterative process, and we have actually iterated. When I started in the CCC 8 years ago, we used to barely do 30 complaints a month. We used to have 1 meeting. We now have 4 meetings a month, and which each meeting is probably processing 50 complaints. So the number of complaints has gone up. The number of complaints that we receive directly from the consumer through the means of our online complaint management system and so on are rising all the time. So it's an iterative process. I don't think that you can build a self-regulatory system that sort of gets static in time. We are going to keep doing this. We are going to keep coming back and saying, hey, we didn't get that right. But using that as a basis for saying that we now need a super authority over and above the ASCII. In any case, the ASCII works in tandem with the law. It's not that the ASCII replaces the law. So if there is something that the ASCII is incapable of doing, or if a consumer does not find satisfaction with the process that we deliver, there is always the court. But the point is, we give a free system, we give a fast system, and we give a system that gives, in natural justice terms, everybody an equal opportunity to be heard, and to be heard by people who are representative of the society in which we live.
Okay, I'm actually going to change the topic of this debate now, and I'm going to call it, whose gripe is it anyway? Let's talk about that consumer. We've all heard about how the consumer is the one who's going to vote with his or her feet at the end of the day. Is that true? Is the consumer actually saying, I don't like what you said over there, I'm not going to buy that product? Or is the consumer just sitting over there, watching the ad, waiting for that soap opera to come back on, should you leave it in the hands of that consumer, particularly when you've got Twitter and Facebook and every other damn thing there is, to decide whether you cross that line or not? Bobby, you're the creative guy. What's your take?
You know what? I think there's no such thing as a free society, right? Complete creative freedom is only going to happen if you are naked and alone on an island, right? That's the only perfect freedom.
I really don't want to know what you're going to do in that case.
No, that's besides the point, right? But in a sense, the people do regulate what we do, right? Because thanks to social media, you hear a lot more from them. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't start regulating ourselves to begin with, right? Because we are speaking on behalf of brands to the people.
Is that true? Should we really be concerned as the advertiser, as the brand that's being advertised, about the handful of people on Twitter who are going to complain? And I'm talking India. I'm not talking about a global society. I'm talking about India, where the large number of people who are going to buy Lifebuoy soap or Surf or any other product that's out there are not on Twitter. So does the fact that the 5 people on Facebook again, does it really matter? Does social media matter in the Indian context when it comes to judging whether what you've done is good or bad?
Increasingly it will, right? It does right now, right? And increasingly it will. And at the end of the day, people vote with their wallets. If they don't like what you're dishing out, they're going to walk away in any case, right? And people are going to hear them, right? That doesn't give you the license to sort of go about abuse your rights. I'm not saying that. But there needs to be a certain amount of freedom. Also, again, whose decency are you talking about, right? That's the whole point. Is there one common moral code? Let's say, for example, if you want to talk about women's rights in Haryana, that'd probably be indecent, right? Because it's a massively patriarchal society. So we've got to, especially if a brand wants to stand for progressive values and catch in on cultural trends that are niche right now, there is a vast majority of society that might find it objectionable, but you're not talking to them. You're talking and trying to promote a cultural thing that's happening in a small pocket.
That's an interesting point, Bobby. If you talk about gender equality in certain parts of this country, it would actually be offensive to the society you are advertising to, rather than the other way around. How do you deal with that, Santosh?
Well, I mean, you encounter questions like that all the time. Any public form of communication will run into the fact that you have your audiences are variegated and they will respond differently. But I think that the thing about advertising, as against any other form of art or any other artistic expression, is the fact that advertising comes with certain constraints and it has certain special qualities. One is that there is a grossly unequal relationship between the advertiser and the audience, which means that there is an additional responsibility on the advertiser to this thing that people can complain on Twitter. A is relatively recent, B, you're not bound to do anything about it, and so it is only in your self-interest to do something about it. It isn't as if you can be compelled to do anything about it. Secondly, unlike other art forms where the common argument against any film, for instance, is that you can choose not to see it. Advertising, on the other hand, makes it business that the consumer has no choice but to see it when the advertiser wants you to see it. In fact, that's the whole point of placing ads in a way that you intrude into people's lives while they want to do something else. So to that extent, I think the whole question of whether advertising what kind of responsibility should advertising feel, I think becomes more significant in its case than it is, I think, in the case of some other forms. As regards the cultural question, I think there, I do feel that somehow, I mean, if you pull back a little, there is this feeling that business has had that it is somehow immune from society and that there is a distance, and whether it's management theory that has postulated the fact that the business of business is business. And therefore, we forget the fact that business is society. And therefore, when, in an earlier conversation, it was said that, one test of whether you want to work on something or not is whether you would want your children to be using that product or to be reacting to whatever it is that you put out. How easily you slip into business being society when you use that framework. But when you are creating advertising, you are detaching yourself from, and business is giving itself the freedom to milk society for whatever it is worth. And to me, this is the fundamental issue. If you do not feel a sense of responsibility, if today you can make ads about gender equality, but at the same time you sell a whitening cream, if today you can talk about sanitary pads, but at the same time sanitary towels for decades have made women ashamed of menstruating and have used, women wearing white jeans and riding horses in order to accentuate and underline their shame. With what face do you today put the spin on the fact that you are taking on a more noble posture? So it boils down to intention. You see, the problem with regulation is this, what Paritosh said is true, that if an external regulator in a subjective form like advertising will always struggle. You will do what Prahlad Nihalani does. These 7 words or 15 words you cannot use.
I think he got those from radio.
So, because how else do you regulate? So it has to be self-regulation. But the problem is, the self does not want to regulate. The self wants to milk and wants to push and squeeze the maximum that it can. Today, it is putting on a noble face simply because it has to. Because there is pressure and because you are running scared, so you talk gender equality. If you had your way, you would shame women.
I'm going to come back to that in a second. Since we're talking about regulation, since we're talking about whether self-regulation works or not, I'm going to turn to Sanjeev. Okay, that was so weak. Can I just point out that the other woman is not clapping? Just saying. Let's look at an industry, Sanjeev's industry. Let's face it, they haven't been known for their honesty. Current industry, banking. I mean, come on, seriously, you really think you're going to get 400% returns? Not happening. I used to be an investment banker, I know how much we lied. For whatever reason, it's not just self-regulation over there. You've got regulation coming out of your rear ends, whether it's in a country like India, whether it's SEBI, whether it's the RBI, whether it's the Ministry of Finance, and that's global. It's across the world. What you say is very, very controlled. Has that made you a better corporate citizen?
I think the first thing I'd say, which is, taking on from what has been said before, is that I think there is, when you look at it with a global lens, and India is not far behind, India in many cases leapfrogs. I think the consumer, which is almost being portrayed as if it's a bechara who is subject to everything that we put out and he or she has to consume it. I think the consumer is increasingly a very educated, knowledgeable, discernible consumer. He or she increasingly depends on peer recommendation. They have ways of comparing what they are buying, comparing the claims. So frankly, apart from the regulator, whether it is an ASCII kind of self-regulator or a formal legal regulator or a government, I believe that today consumers are their own regulators, and to my mind, that is the strongest, if you like, barrier to a business gone wild. To your saying, to a very good expression that you made, Santosh, of business of business, I think you just cannot afford to, as a business, to do something and hope to get away with it. Because there will be people in society who are in the tens of millions. I know you gave the example of Twitter, but India is Facebook's second largest market and will overtake the US very shortly. The fact of the matter is, increasingly, we are seeing, and across industries, it's not just banking, because banking is regulated, we increasingly see many more complaints coming through at an individual level, but then there is this mushrooming effect which organizations and industries absolutely dread. And we have seen enough examples. There are YouTube examples of airlines in the US which have had to change their policies because of the phenomenally negative effect that one complaint can mushroom into. And I think, to my mind, in addition to the work that we are doing in terms of self-regulation, that is, to my mind, the best regulation that's happening. That's point number one. The only other point I'll make, in addition to what you just said, is that, frankly, when we talk creativity, a lot of it has to be driven by true innovation. And sometimes the desperate efforts at creativity that come, which seem to cross the line, and I was carefully looking at what the ASCII video showed, is because pretty much every industry is in a commoditized mode. So if you think about it, if there is not much to choose, it becomes more sensational, to the point that John was making earlier, rather than true creativity. And I think that's the challenge. Because if true innovation drives what we are marketing as marketers, I think our creativity will come through just based on that innovation.
So this is like the girl who had a little curl right in the middle of her forehead, right? When she was good, she was very, very good, but when she was bad, she was better. So if you take that point, if you push the envelope, if you toe the boundary without actually crossing it, or you try and cross the boundary without getting caught, does that make for better advertising? The fact that you're getting away with it.
I don't think so. I think the basic principles of, honesty, decency, and again, it is a social norm, but organizations have to understand that there is nothing called now and one country's requirement versus another country and the standards being different, because the world is increasingly becoming one place. And in some organizations which are global, you cannot have different standards of communication in different countries of the world just because the law is different. You cannot. It's just not allowed. But having said that, the fact of the matter is that the basic principles are never to be compromised. You cannot. And I fully agree with what was said earlier, that is absolutely a given. But to my mind, the new dynamic of this world in the area of regulation is the consumer himself or herself. Because to my mind, that is a phenomenal force. And that can be harnessed. Because, that can build a consensus against or for a point of view which can be phenomenal.
Okay, Shantanu is still here?
I can see him.
I have to be very nice to Shantanu. He gave me detention many times in school. So we're all going to agree with everything he said. But one of the things that he said was, and one of the things that you're all saying, is the consumer creates the rules. Is that what it comes down to? You're actually saying that we listen to our consumer to tell us when we're going wrong? Seriously? The consumer's an idiot.
No. The consumer is also your spouse.
Your wife, yeah.
Ogilvy said it, I didn't say it.
I rest my case.
Yeah. But no, I think it's, while there is, he beat you up. He was also my boss briefly. He didn't beat me up that much. I might be lying. But I think the cardinal principles of what constitutes a code actually are pretty straightforward. It's 4 words that, and none of them are new or unusual. Basically, what has been said earlier today also is that you need to have integrity, you need to have fidelity to be able to earn trust, right? So if you deliver fidelity on your message, and if you deliver integrity of message, and you deliver it consistently over a period of time, you win trust. And if you fail on either, then you lose trust. So those are not hard rules. In many senses, the core of the code is really those 4 words, right? You must be fair in your competition, that you must be decent in your communication, that you must be honest, and you must be responsible. Now, this is not rocket science.
Can I interrupt for a second? I don't think anyone's got any beef with 3 of those 4.
And the
Okay?
decency is
honesty,
the one.
Honesty is honesty. Fairness is fairness.
Yeah.
Right? All of that
No,
integrity is
fairness
wonderful.
is not fairness. You see,
Bring it back to decency.
No, let
Okay?
me stay with fairness for
Okay.
a moment. Was it fair for Trevor Chappell to bowl the way he did? It was legal. It was not permitted. But, and it won Australia that particular match. And it brought a lot of ignominy to the game. And at this time, I guess, we all know what I'm talking about back in 1981. But therefore, just because it was correct according to the rules of the game, it still was not fair, right? And that non-fairness happens all the time. It happens in all kinds of ways. People very carefully choose the context in which they wish to be compared. I mean, my primary business is television, and the television industry does it all the time. People will find a slot between 6 and 9 p.m. for a period of 3 weeks between week 23 and week 25, and say during that time I was leader, and the advertising headline says number 1 in the news business. You know, statistical rubbish. And Dorab frequently has to sort of take a view on this. It is absolute statistical nonsense, but routinely claimed. So it's not that we've gone away. I mean, decency, you're right, you know, is very much in your face, and let's say the egregious violations are very obviously egregious. I mean, we had an ad from a fashion company which had a rather well upholstered woman basically covered in sticky tape, in packing tape, and it said for sale. Now, thankfully, even before we went into complaint on an emergency basis against that advertiser saw the sense of taking that campaign down. So it got taken down very quickly. You will also remember, you know, so there is decency, and I know decency issues are, they get magnified and amplified. But fairness, honesty, these are very, very real questions, and we deal with them all the time. And you know, there are in